சார்.
என்னப்பா? சாரி,
நீங்கள் ஸ்டார்ட் பண்ணலாம் சார்.
ஓகே ஓகே. நண்பர்களே, போன முறை கிட்டத்தட்ட முழுமையாக ஆங்கிலத்திலே பேசிட்டேன். அது இயல்பாக ஒரு மொழியில் தூங்கும் பொழுது அதிலே போயிடுது. அது இப்போ தமிழ் ஆரம்பிச்சா தமிழ்லேயே போகும். சில பேர் கேட்டாங்க, தமிழில் பேசுவாரா அப்படின்னு கேட்டிருக்காங்க அந்த நெட்டில். நான் 2-3 உரைகள் தமிழில் தான் நிகழ்த்தியிருக்கிறேன். பரவாயில்ல. இன்னைக்கு நாளைக்கோட நம்ம இந்த ரவுண்டு முடிக்கிறோம். இன்னைக்கு 2014 to 19 இந்தியன் எக்கானமி எப்படி இருந்துச்சு. இப்போ நான் ஏன் ஒரு காரணம் இங்கிலீஷில் பேசுகிறேன்னா, யூடியூப்ல போடுறோம், பலரும் பயன்படுத்துவாங்க. இங்கே தமிழில் மட்டும் இருந்தால் நிறைய பேர் பயன்படுத்த முடியாமல் போயிடும். அதுவும் இருக்கிறதுனால தான் ஐம் ஷூர் மை இங்கிலீஷ் இஸ் சிம்பிள் enough for you to follow. ஸோ ஐ வில் ஸ்பீக் இன் இங்கிலீஷ். அப்புறம் நம்ம பின்னாடி ஒரு செஷனில் தமிழில் கூட இன்ட்ராக்ஷன் வச்சுக்கலாம். ஓகே, ஸோ we have already seen what was the track record of the Indian economy between 1991 and 2014 in terms of overall economic growth as measured by the rate of growth of GDP, its sectoral composition as between primary sector, secondary sector and tertiary sector, and the extent to which the kind of economic growth that occurred in that period, 1991 to 2014, led to improvements in living conditions of the people as measured, for example, by the poverty ratio, head count measure of poverty. What impact did it have on employment? And of course, also questions such as what was the nature of the fiscal policy, what was the relationship between the Indian economy and the rest of the world economy. Some of these things were discussed. And the policies pursued since 1991, I have broadly termed them neoliberal policies, and I mentioned to you the three features of neoliberal policy, namely deregulation or liberalization, which is the removal of norms of accountability from private players, especially large private players. Second, the feature of privatization, which involves both the disinvestment of government shares in government-owned enterprises and the opening up to the private sector of domains historically considered the responsibility of the state, such as health, education, infrastructure, which in turn lead to increasing costs of education and healthcare and infrastructure, thus putting poor people at risk in terms of their ability to access these facilities. Third, we said we are looking at globalization, which again has two components. One is the trade liberalization or the regulations concerning imports and exports of goods and services. And the other, perhaps even more important, are the regulations concerning the inflow and outflow of capital as finance. And overall, we recall that the argument made for the reforms was that these reforms, by opening up the economy, would usher in a more efficient economic regime. Manufacturers and other producers will be able to access inputs globally, cheaply, and then produce on a global market, so that India would be able to export more and more and thus cover its import costs. Likewise, the incentives provided to capital, domestic and foreign, would lead to large investments, and that would in turn enhance economic growth and expand opportunities and allow people's incomes to grow, and in the process poverty would be reduced. So the expectation was that there will be a significant reduction in poverty, there will be a significant increase in employment, especially non-agricultural employment in the manufacturing sector, and that India's balance of payments would be very comfortable with an excess of exports over imports. But in the event, we saw that this did not quite happen. That between 1991 and 2014, India's balance of trade, as far as the merchandise trade is concerned, that is the value of exports of physical goods vis-a-vis the value of imports of physical goods, was consistently negative, meaning we were always importing more than we were exporting in value terms of physical goods. This was to some extent balanced by a net export of services and also by inward remittances of Indians living abroad. But even those two items did not altogether eliminate the merchandise trade deficit. Therefore, we had to always seek foreign exchange inflows. And this is also why the regimes successive regimes try to incentivize inflows of foreign finance capital into the Indian economy by allowing them to enter and exit at will, and not putting any restrictions on their operations here, not requiring them to invest productively, but just even speculatively play the market, stock market, commodities market, and so on. And all of this, of course, makes you dependent on the flows of international finance capital into and out of the country. This had implications for macroeconomic policy. Government was afraid to adopt policies that could disincentivize domestic and foreign capitalists for fear this would impact on growth. Also, especially, government was particularly careful not to offend foreign finance capital, because given the constant difficulties vis-a-vis foreign exchange with excess of imports over exports, we were always looking to foreign currency inflows to help us with our balance of payments on the current account. So this is the broad scenario, and we saw that yes, if you take the entire period, economic growth was not unimpressive, at about 6% per annum compound or thereabouts. In some years more, the most important years where economic growth was significantly higher was the band 2004 to 8. The periods of very slow growth, 1998 to 2004, for example. And then there are periods when growth rose and fell, as between 2008-9, when it fell in the global economic crisis, and then it recovered, but it fell from 11-12 onwards till we get to the 13-14 end year of the earlier regime. Overall, there was certainly some poverty reduction, but not clear how much. The definitions of poverty were seriously contested, and after a while, we didn't really have any credible estimates of poverty, particularly since the attempt to use per capita monthly consumer expenditure as the criterion for the poverty line became increasingly problematic, because this contradicted more and more the direct data on nutritional intakes of households. So the data on nutritional intakes from the same survey was showing a rise in poverty, but the data on per capita monthly consumer expenditure was showing some reduction in poverty. So these became very contentious, and particularly strong critique of this was made by Professor Utsa Patnaik on hunger in India, and that's really the Republic of Hunger was the title of her article in 2004. Subsequently, she has written on urban hunger as well, urban poverty estimates as well in EPW and so on. So some of the references you can look up, and I'll try and send some references to your office. So poverty reduction was not particularly impressive. There's even an argument that poverty may have absolutely increased, at least for some sections of the population. Employment expansion was problematic, and I have shown you some figures, or mentioned some figures last time. Today we will talk about the subsequent period as to what happened. But overall, the period 91 to 2014 saw, as I said, a compound rate of growth of around 6% per annum, which is roughly the same that we had in the decade preceding reforms. So, from 1980-81 onwards, you can say India has been on a higher trend rate of growth of around 6% as compared to the period from 1950 to 80. That's all you can say. You can't say that the period of neoliberal reforms is characterized by a significantly higher rate of economic growth in terms of GDP. 1. 2, even though GDP growth rates have been quite impressive, overall at 6%, these have not led to significant reduction in poverty and significant increase in productive employment. Number 3, the dependence on self-employment remains high, and the rise of productivity in agriculture does not keep pace with the need to move workers out of the labor force of agriculture and into non-agricultural occupations. So we have a problem of the classic development problem of not being able to industrialize comprehensively, which has to do with our policies as well as our structures. And the third point that I mentioned was our constant Bop crisis. Now, essentially, this is an important lesson, because what are we saying? We're saying that although in 1991, when we embarked on the reforms, we thought that both the fiscal crisis of the state, in terms of the state being unable to raise adequate resources to fund investments to sustain economic growth and running into large deficits, budget deficits and fiscal deficits, that they would go away with reforms. They have not gone away. They have in fact remained intensified despite our passing legislation to limit the fiscal deficit of the government of India to just 3% of GDP by the financial year 2008-9. That has remained largely unimplemented. So deficits remain significant. Fiscal crunch is constantly talked about domestically. Likewise, the balance of payment situation also has not been transformed to one of comfort. We are still very much dependent on forex inflows, which have been coming. So, the stock markets have survived and prospered and also fell and risen over this period. But we have become critically dependent on constant inflows of foreign exchange from abroad. And that has serious repercussions for your freedom of macroeconomic policy. If government wanted to, for example, increase public expenditure in order to promote economic growth, then if it does so through government spending, financed by borrowing, that would lead to a large fiscal deficit. And this would be frowned upon by foreign investors who would then take the money out of the country. This is the fear, this is the apprehension. And therefore, there's been a very strong tendency in India, in the policy-making circles, towards deflationary fiscal policies that tend to restrict government spending, and also to manage the government deficit primarily by reducing expenditure rather than effectively taxing the wealthy. This is the broad contours of policy, and the consequences we've already reviewed, so I won't pursue this anymore. Nevertheless, the one final point that needs to be remembered from last time is that in the period 91 to 2014, there were distinct phases. As I said, 98 to 2004 was a difficult phase, slow growth and significant suffering. 2004 to 14 was somewhat better in terms of economic growth, but primarily the years of high growth were 2004 to 8. And they were years in which the central regime was dependent on outside support. And those forces which lent outside support, the left parties and civil society forces, they extracted some compensation for the support in terms of the passing of the Right to Information Act, passing of the Right to National Rural Guarantee Employment Act, even a diluted Right to Education in 2009, and of course also the Tribal Forest Rights Act, all of which were pro-people legislations and helped a little bit. But nevertheless, overall, wealth inequality rose, income inequality rose, and this is the period during which India's taxation regime was becoming increasingly favorable to the corporate sector, and indirect taxes continued to be very significant. Now, what did 2014 to 19 mark a break with 2004 to 14, and if so, in what direction? That's what we can look at today. First of all, around 2014, the numbers change. Okay? GDP estimates change. In the last 2 years of the UPA 2 regime, 12, 13 and 13, 14, India reports low growth rates of GDP at factor cost, around 5% and 4.5%. But suddenly, 2014, 15, 16, you get economic survey reporting growth rates of 6.5% and 7%. It turns out that this has to do with a revision in the method of computation of GDP, which gives a one-time boost to GDP growth rates and also subsequently has some implications for leading to overestimation of GDP. Three major changes came in the measurement of GDP. One was that we moved from GDP in terms of factor cost, which is basically the cost of all the factors of production used up in producing the output, wages and all other costs, material costs and so on, to one where we moved to measuring GDP at market prices. So the difference is that GDP at market prices is GDP at factor cost plus all indirect taxes which go to raise the price of commodities, minus subsidies, if any, given to specific products. So GDP at factor cost plus indirect taxes minus net product subsidies. This is your GDP at market prices, which will be generally higher, much higher than the GDP at factor cost, which has the further implication that between two successive years, there will be no change in physical output. You can think of an example where there is no change in physical output, but because you've added indirect taxes, GDP at market prices will show growth. GDP at factor cost never, but GDP at market prices will show growth. So sometimes the growth can be, I would say, misleading because it's brought about by tax regime rather than real increase in output on the ground. So these are things to keep in mind, but this is one change that we move from GDP at factor cost to GDP at market prices, saying this is the international practice. Second thing was we changed the base year, which is again done periodically. There's nothing wrong with that. So we changed the base year from 2004-5 to 2011-12, which automatically tends to provide some boost for 1 year because the more faster growing sectors have a higher weight in the new index based on 11-12, and the declining sectors of course will exit. So there is some automatic boost to growth rate GDP measures when you revise the base year in this manner, which is legitimate. It's done all the time, done by earlier regimes also. But the third important measure that made a big difference, or continues to be an important problem for comparison purposes, is the fact that we now began to estimate the output of the informal non-agricultural sector. In the formal corporate informal sector does much more poorly than the formal sector. And we have reason to believe that this is in fact the case between 2014 and 19, and I'll come to that in a minute. The other important feature of the 2014-19 period, there were 3 or 4 very important events which we'll spend some time on. But the GDP measurement I just talked about, there are 3 changes. One is the move from GDP at factor cost to GDP at market prices, which gives an automatic boost to GDP for any given year because of a rise in indirect taxes. So you could have growth which is really not real growth. Second is the shift in base year, which is routinely done and which in turn has a one-time impact on the GDP level for any given year when you change the base. And therefore shows a slightly higher growth rate. And then the third, which is about estimating the non-formal sector from the formal sector growth estimates as reported by the reporting agents, economic agents themselves, the corporate sector. This has big implications in terms of overestimating GDP growth when the informal sector is doing much, or the non-corporate sector is doing much more poorly than the corporate sector, which is the case indeed in India. So, with this in background, in fact, the former chief economic advisor to the Ministry of Finance in that period, who authored several of the economic surveys, Professor Arvind Subramaniam, later on, once he had demitted office and returned to the academic world, wrote a long paper in which he actually contested the estimates that he himself had reported an economic survey on India's GDP growth rates, and essentially saying that whatever growth rates you find marked in official data, suppose you say 8%, you mark it down by 2 percentage points, it is more like 6%. So if 6% growth rate is reported, it is more like 4%. In other words, this really brought GDP growth rates from 2014 to 19, at least a good part of that, more or less in alignment with the growth rates in the last 2 years of the UPA2 regime, which is really quite poor growth rates, 5% or so, based on the old way of estimating growth rates. So, this is a contested area, but official growth rates will be 7%, but the real growth rate as measured on a comparable basis will be more like 5%. So one has to keep this in mind when one looks at economic survey data and statistics on India's growth rates and so on. I don't want to get too technical. I mean, this is a broad audience, so I don't want to get into too much of economics, but we can discuss it maybe later on. Anyway, so this is one part of the story. But the major events, economic events, policy events of 2014 to 19 were clearly the demonetization carried out in 2016, followed within a few months by the implementation of the goods and services tax. Now, it turned out that both were quite important measures which had a hugely negative impact on the informal sector and the smaller players in the economy. I say informal sector, I mean both informal non-agricultural sector and agricultural sector as well. So let's take each of them in turn. We'll spend a little time on that. Because as I said, I've already said that if you take overall growth rates 14 to 19, they wouldn't look radically different from growth rates in the period 12 to 14, which is when the growth rates were declining and lower than earlier. They wouldn't be at all comparable to the growth rates of, say, 2004-8. In a sense, they would also help in bringing down the overall growth rate for the period 91 to 2019 marginally. I haven't done the estimates, but one can do that. So let's now look at demonetization, and let's look at GST, one after the other. Now, on the 8th of November 2016, in an evening broadcast to the nation, Prime Minister announced that with effect from midnight of November 8, 2016, rupee notes of denomination 500 and 1000 rupees will cease to be legal tender. What a dramatic announcement. Cost a lot of eyebrows to be raised. There had been no process of consultation within the government, with the RBI or in the Ministry of Finance or anywhere else. It seemed like a measure announced by the Prime Minister and taken more or less by the Prime Minister, maybe with some close confidence, we don't know. But in any event, it does not discuss with the RBI, it does not discuss with the full Ministry of Finance machinery. And so it is a very sudden move. The most important thing to note is that this measure took out of circulation 86% of the currency then in supply. So if you take out 86% of a country's money supply, that's a very drastic measure. It will cause, as you will know from your macroeconomics, collapse of the economy. And it did, contrary to all the claims being made on its behalf. When the Prime Minister himself, when he made the speech announcing this measure, well, gave time until midnight on November 8, which of course enabled jewelry shops to remain very crowded that evening, giving us some hint as to what are the forms in which black wealth is held in this country. Certainly not currency. They go much more into jewelry and real estate and so on. I'll come to this point again a little later. But the claims made for the measure in the speech of the Prime Minister himself were four important claims. One was that this would help eliminate black wealth in the country, what more popularly called black money. Black money will go. Second, that this would eliminate fake currency. Claim was that fake currencies were being brought in here by enemies of the country in order to further their cause, and so we had to identify and get rid of fake currencies. And this was supposed to be a measure that would ensure that fake currencies were identified and put away. Third claim was that this would lead to elimination of terrorism, partly on the argument that terrorism is being funded by black money and fake currencies. And the fourth claim was that once demonetization is done, corruption will simply go away, because now all the corruption has led to money being held in these large denominations, and once you got rid of that and moved towards a much more systematically recorded economy, where all receipts and expenditures are being recorded, then of course corruption would go. But all these claims were hardly credible. On black money, the notion that illegalization of notes of large denomination like 500 and 1,000 rupees would eliminate black wealth in the country is a breathtaking assertion. Of course, it's also ironic that while this was being declared, RBI was asked to print 2,000 rupee notes. So, you wonder what is the logic behind printing 2,000 rupee notes when you're outlawing existing 500,000 rupee notes. Anyway, be that as it may, it is expected by some of the spokesmen for the government or for those who are supporting this measure that, a lot of the black money would simply have to be held as currency, would simply have to be surrendered, and in view of their being unable to explain the sources of such money, some people may just burn their money. So it was said, something like, estimates varied, but some people are claiming something like 3 to 5 lakh crore rupees worth of black money, black currency, would not come back into the banking system. And this would be bonanza, because it means RBI's obligations become less. It's a bonanza for RBI, and RBI can share the bonanza with the government. All sorts of speculations are being put forward in order to justify the measures of the government of India. They were patently false. Because various tax rates over the years had suggested that a more realistic measure of black wealth held in the form of currency would hardly amount to 5 to 6% of the total quantum of black wealth. Black wealth being by definition wealth that has escaped taxation is invariably held mostly in real physical assets like jewelry, land and real estate. It's also held in foreign accounts, which are not accessible to the Indian tax authorities. And it's therefore, extremely unlikely that much black wealth could be unearthed just by attacking notes, currency notes of a particular denomination. And the estimate of black wealth held as currency from the various tax rates that we have data for is more like 5 to 6%. So 95% of black wealth is in non-monetary forms, certainly not held as currency. So this measure would have hardly any impact on those forms in which black wealth was being held. In fact, the former chief economic advisor and the former RBI governor, Dr. Raghuram Rajan, was once asked, not in relation to the government of India's November 8th measure, but in a different context earlier, in fact, when he was giving a lecture in India, he was asked about this. And the question was asked, he said, no, what do you mean? You mean by demonetization, the rendering illegal of certain large denomination currencies? And he said this would not in any way be very effective for attacking black wealth, the black economy. It would make things difficult for the poor, but the rich will get a way around it. Exactly what happened. The rich found their way around it, but the poor were great sufferers in this process, including the loss of over 100 lives, including of bank employees, of people who stood in queues to get their money, collapsing and losing their lives, and so on and so forth. So, I don't want to get into the various consequences, tragic consequences of devaluation, demonetization, except to say that over 100 people died in these queues and in the other incidents related to demonetization. Very tragic and eminently avoidable loss of human lives. But that apart, the argument that black wealth would disappear with demonetization was clearly incorrect. On the contrary, in the process, in the way in which it was carried out, with all the money coming back into the RBI, it is possible to argue, as some people have, the demonetization ended up whitening some black money rather than the other way around. Anyway, so that's one part of it. The second argument for demonetization was put forward as the fake currency issue. Well, again, we have estimates from the government, from the Indian Statistical Institute and other data sources, that the extent of extent of currency identified as possibly fake currency, estimated the fake currencies in circulation, value of fake currency in circulation is estimated at about 400 crores. It is a very, very minuscule percentage of the total value of currency in circulation. Hardly 0.2% is thereabouts. So there was really no need to use a hammer to kill a fly. It's completely unwarranted. If fake currency was the issue, this was not the measure. It could have just gradually retired older notes, and in fact the RBI had been doing from time to time. Again, this is what people like Agrarian mentioned, and others also mentioned this. And the RBI governor, who at that time had to go along with government more or less, later on, of course, took a different view, and many other economists, including those from the International Monetary Fund, who were quite neoliberal and who were aligned closely with the government of India, even they opined that this was not a good idea, it was a bad measure, and it set India back quite a bit. Caused immense suffering to people. The third and fourth claims were also equally unbelievable. The claim that this would stop terrorism because black money was supporting terrorism turned out to be empirically untrue because we had plenty of terrorist incidents afterwards. So I won't go into that very highly charged political issue. Likewise, they claim that this would eliminate corruption. Maybe rhetorically made, but I mean, coming from the Prime Minister, this has a certain weight among the popular minds, the minds of the people. This is quite particularly spectacularly absurd because in an economy driven by private profit and characterized by the private ownership of the means of production, every economic transaction carries some potential for corruption. So just by eliminating currency notes of a particular denomination, you're not going to eliminate corruption. Every transaction has a potential. But it's not about corruption being associated, as it often is, with government. Just imagine for a simpler understanding, suppose you were the purchase manager in a large private company. Then vendors of the company would certainly want to be on good terms with you, and they would be willing to offer incentives of various kinds. So this has nothing to do with whether ownership is private or public, whether the sector is private or public. It has to do with the fact that this system provides incentive to underreport incomes or do other unlawful things, because the system legitimizes and values monetary wealth and acquisition of monetary gain. So, this issue of corruption is much more complex than just being something that can be dealt with by a single sledgehammer demonetization. As it turned out, what demonetization did was not to achieve any of the four items that have been mentioned of tackling black wealth, eliminating fake currency, eliminating corruption, eliminating terrorism, but it in fact set India back significantly by disrupting the economy hugely. Because India is essentially an economy where a very large proportion of transactions and as well as a very large proportion of the value of all transactions takes place in cash. And so when cash of certain denominations is suddenly made to disappear, then these transactions become difficult to carry out. So, greatly disrupted trade and economic activity. It affected agriculture as well. I will not go into detail, plenty of literature on this. There is a book authored by Professors Prabhat Patnaik, C.P. Chandrasekhar, and Jayati Ghosh on demonetization and its implications. There is a book authored by Dr. Ram Manohar Reddy, formerly editor of Economic and Political Weekly, and earlier with the Hindu and so on, who was earlier the CDS Trivandrum, an economist, who has written a very good book on demonetization. There are many things. We have all written articles. I have written articles. Other economists have written articles. And what we can say is that the consensus opinion in the profession is certainly that demonetization was absolutely a disastrous measure, completely unwarranted. It's not just Raghuram Rajan who is saying it. It's a whole lot of, as I said, right up to the IMF top brass was steeped in neoliberal economics. Even they are saying. So in other words, what is distinctive about the 2014-19 regime is that it was not only neoliberal, but it had brought these additional, shall we say, eccentricities into policy making. These chaotic, completely random policy measures, taken without any consultation, completely centralized and so on. These are disruptive for any economy. The economy requires consultation and consensus building, but the regime that has come into being in 2014 does not believe in consensus. It operates by dramatic actions. Now, then this was it was very quickly recognized, and agencies like the Center for Monitoring Indian Economy put up estimates of job losses on account of demonetization, which led to closures of a large number of small and medium and tiny informal units, which hurt agriculture greatly, both for starting a new crop and for selling the old crops, and so on. And it caused a considerable increase in unemployment. So, I am not again going into all those estimates of how much increase in unemployment was caused by demonetization, etc. But we know that there was a considerable economic damage. And yet, of course, the Government of India reported in the economic survey in 2017, February, that the year 2016-17, the rate of growth GDP was more than 7%. It even revised to 8% later. And so all this, these very high estimates of GDP growth in a year like 16-17, or in a year like 17-18 when the GST brought in a lot of confusion. These strained the credibility of the Government of India's GDP estimates. That's all one can say, without being more, rude. But in point of fact, demonetization caused tremendous suffering for ordinary people, especially for working people, for small producers, for the informal sector, traders and MSMEs and everyone. It may have boosted the political and economic prospects of some people. For example, one argument that has been put forward, I'm not either defending or refuting it, was that the act of demonetization on November 8th essentially paralyzed the opposition parties in UP, where elections were due shortly, because they would now find it much more difficult to get access to cash, because those denominations were very popular in electoral cash transactions, shall we say. Whereas the ruling party might have had wind of it before it occurred, so they may have been prepared. In fact, a remark the Prime Minister made in a speech, saying that the opposition parties are opposing demonetization because they were not prepared, has the unfortunate implication that the ruling party was prepared, possibly. I'm not saying that's the implication. That could be one implication that one can draw. So this is tricky. I don't want to get into the big argument about demonetization, but pretty much the consensus among economists on a purely economic level is that it impacted very negatively on the Indian economy's growth prospects, notwithstanding the data put out by the Government of India subsequently on growth rates in 16-17. Now, what about GST? GST came shortly thereafter. It came in 2017 June in a dramatic event which some would consider somewhat comic. June 30th, 2017, there was this midnight, there was a meeting in the Parliament Hall ushering in the GST regime based on a pact that the states and the Government of India entered into. Almost like it's a new freedom ceremony. So, one hardly thought that tax regime would be taken as a proxy for a country's date with freedom. But there it was. So for me, it was distinctly odd, I can personally say. But in any event, what the argument was in GST had been, not the sole property of the regime in office in 2017. It had been discussed for almost a decade and a half, right from Vajpayee government time onward, been discussion on and off, on and off. What did the GST regime do? It's important to reflect on that a little bit. At this, especially in Tamil Nadu, we've had some very bitter experience with GST. Not just people, but also the state government, in terms of not being able to get the revenues it was promised. But what did the GST do? Well, it did several things. First of all, at the political economy level, it greatly reduced the resource-raising powers of the state governments. In an allegedly federal setup like India, Constitution says we are a federal setup. It is a quasi-federal setup. But by removing from the state government the power to tax commodities, goods and services, except for 4 specified items: tobacco, alcohol, diesel and petrol. All other commodities, goods and services, their tax rates, A, would be uniform across the country, and B, would be decided by the GST Council, where the states were also there. So was the centre, but the centre had greater representation, and centre could always muster, with the help of states ruled by the same party as the one in the centre, enough clout to defeat any individual state's proposal for any revision in tax rate. So essentially, the states were completely disarmed and disempowered in relation to their ability to raise resources for development. Now, this is very serious because, you all should understand that in India, the people of each state, they elect the state governments. State governments are not nominated. Sometimes they behave as if they are, but they are not nominated. Which means that these state governments, as governments elected by people, especially with the states broadly being organized along linguistic nationality lines historically, with some changes after independence, linguistic basis and nationality basis. So certain ethnic homogeneity also is implied here. So these are like, in a way, they are like nation states. Like, not quite, because they don't have the right to secede and run their own armed forces and so on. But the Constitution visualized a considerable, space for elected state governments to be able to handle issues pertaining to their people. And taxation clearly was one of the most important powers of an elected government. Why do you elect governments? If they can't tax, they can't raise resources, what's the point of electing governments? So governments are expected to address people's issues through resources mobilized by them in various ways. And yet this GST completely denuded the state governments of their powers of taxation. And of course, in principle, you could say, no, but states were all there in GST council, so they're also party. So they, in fact, they've been taken to a different level. But that's a very silly justification because de facto, GST council is strongly dominated by the center. Although, when some states unite, they can make a lot of noise, as has been happening recently. Recently, under extraordinary circumstances. But then what happened was the GST not only denuded the states of their powers of resource mobilization, but it also did something much more important that people don't notice, which is prior to the GST, private enterprises, all enterprises, all businesses, with an annual turnover of 1.5 crores or less, did not have to pay any excise duties. For manufacturing, this is extremely important. But GST, in its initial version, it's been modified now, initial version, put the limit at 20 lakh rupees a year, at which GST would kick in. So even an enterprise, an annual turnover of say 20 lakh rupees, in some states 10 lakh rupees, would come under the GST ambit, which means it must keep a record of its transactions, it must have a computer, it must be able to engage an auditor, all of that. And it has to do a lot of form filling as well. So GST ended up being a way to penalize small informal players in the system by forcing them to pay taxes where they were earlier not paying them, and by forcing them to keep records of transactions and maintain books of account and incur costs of filing that they had not had to incur earlier. And most important, it gave petty local tax officials the power to harass the small guys. Extraordinary, considering that the government had come into office on the slogan of minimum government and maximum governance. Now you're getting maximum government and minimum governance. The government would poke into a petty shop owner's accounts. So this is extraordinary. This is, by all accounts, it's surprising that it got through. Of course, ultimately, reality did force some changes, and later on, these limits were raised from 20 lakhs to 40 lakhs and so on. And I'm not getting into the details, but many aspects of the GST regime were later tweaked. But one of the rationales for GST was this very attractive slogan, one nation, one tax. And the argument, interstate trade will become much easier, there will be no tolls and no hassles, you don't have to wait across state borders. But some of it is simply not true, some of it is okay, valid. All this was being made, but at the end of the day, we didn't have one nation, one tax. Even with GST, we had one nation, several taxes. Tax rates varied across commodities, obviously, and the tax rates kept getting tweaked and rejigged all the time. So far from the, certainty, that predictability and rule-based behavior that the GST was supposed to encourage, the actual GST that came into being ended up being extremely poorly designed and proved extremely disruptive for the economy, just as demonetization had proved disruptive. And again, as demonetization had done, GST was particularly harmful to the informal sector, which most of whose elements did not have the wherewithal to maintain books of account and etc., and were then subject to the harassment of the local tax authority. In fact, around this, the government of India did one more thing, which has now gone unnoticed, which is the act they brought in on cattle transactions buying and selling cattle. It was a serious matter. It caused a lot of disruption in the north. But it's a minor. People have forgotten this now. But again, these are all examples of very disruptive measures unilaterally brought by the government of India without any, concern for the implications for states or for sections of the population. In any event, GST was, the states ultimately agreed to GST on the understanding that, that many of them thought that, if they're primarily consuming states, they would gain. And then the ones that expected to lose were brought into the deal by being promised GST compensation for the potential loss of revenue to their state governments from the implementation of GST. Because what has happened with the pandemic coming in, or even before that, the GST compensation promised to the states by the government of India in the solemn agreement, which led to the GST Act, has actually reneged on the promise now. We can't pay compensation in the position of the center because they're citing the pandemic as one cause. But even earlier, they were not paying GST compensation on time, nor were they sending the states their share of the GST in time. So GST has been good for the center, but not so good for the states, and not so good for the economy as a whole. In fact, in the run-up to the GST, all sorts of tall claims were made. The claims were made that, GST in place, elimination of bottlenecks and unnecessary stoppages and so on, and a more transparent tax regime, we would have a rise of even up to 2 percentage points in our GDP growth. This is a claim that was being made on behalf of the lobbyists who pushed for GST, but nothing of the sort happened. If anything, things got worse. And now everybody admits that things got worse. So these two measures, demonetization and GST, have greatly disrupted the economy. So disruptive actions characterized economic policy in the period 2014 to 19, which did not see much, any kind of dramatic improvement in either growth rates or in the distribution of the benefits of growth. If anything, as I will show you in the remaining part of this class, that the 2014 to 19 period saw a worsening of three major issues that now confront Indian economy and were in place even before the pandemic arrived in January 2020. Pandemic arrived on January 30th, 2020 when Kerala found infection of COVID and then took strong measures. But the economy had begun to slow down much earlier. So even before COVID arrived, we had a problem. And the problem of slowing demand and therefore a sustained reduction in the growth rate of the economy started much earlier in 2018-19 itself, partly because of the double whammy, the double blow that demonetization and GST represented. What are these three major issues that emerged around 2018-19 and 19-20? One was something that had already been there, the Agrarian Crisis. We talked about it last time. It was there part of the 1991-2014 period also. And the Agrarian Crisis, the two major and most important dimensions. One, of course, was the tragic phenomenon of farmer suicides. But the other, equally important, and in the economic sense, a continuing problem, even if suicides were to subside to some extent, which is that the significant proportion of small and marginal cultivators could not get positive income from crop cultivation, that they were making losses. The structure of input costs and output prices for farm produce was such that a very large number of cultivator households simply could not derive any net income from crop cultivation, in fact, had negative income from crop cultivation. This is what many surveys report, although the CACP, the Committee on Agricultural Cost and Prices, does not seem to adequately recognize this fact. But surveys by independent researchers, such as, for example, from the Foundation for Agrarian Studies and many others, have seen that the actual costs of cultivation are not fully recovered by a fairly significant proportion of the small and marginal farming households which operate less than 2 hectares of land. This means that farming is becoming unviable. For a significant crop agriculture and farming is becoming unviable for a significant part of the population. Some of them are tenants and they take on the tenancy contracts even though it's loss making because they may get some byproduct from grain production, which, like hay, which they can use for cattle, and income from livestock may compensate them partially and enable them to derive some income. So it's a very precarious existence. See, this is something that urban folk do not often understand, that if rural households, if a section of rural households by great effort reach even the abysmal official poverty line, they have not done it for free. They have done it through exceptionally hard work, through farming activity, non-farming activity, working for wages outside, working for wages in agriculture, outside agriculture, maybe running a small petty enterprise, in addition to hard work in cultivation. So the number of hours of work that a farm household puts in that belongs to the category poor and small peasants is in relation to the net income they from all these activities. This is invisible. You see, the poverty estimates only tell you some head count of how many people are on the poverty line. It doesn't tell you what is the amount of toil and effort required for some households to even reach the poverty because of the low wages or because of the low returns to cultivation or because of very low returns to non-agricultural economic activity for small enterprises. You know, if you look at the data for India, something like 95% of India's non-agricultural enterprises or basically what you call one account enterprises where they hardly employ any outside labor, they have family labor, maybe one or two hired people. Very, very tiny, very small. And these are all precarious units of existence. They may last any time and all of them require supplementary sources of income. So, you know, if the poor in India manage to reach the poverty line, it's because they do extremely hard work, no gifting it. So all this, you know, this rhetoric of freebies and so on that you often hear in the popular press are so insulting to a section of the population that is not merely poor, but it is hardworking. It is, you know, the working poor. In India, remember, in India we do not have a social security system of any kind that is worth mentioning for the most part of the population. Except in the formal sector, something may be there. But for a very large part of the population, we don't have any worthwhile social security system. And then what that means is that they cannot afford not to be at work. Nobody is going to feed them. So, you know, your reported unemployment rates in India will always be low. So nobody is going to sit idle and nobody will report to you saying I was idle the whole year. And actual underemployment of labor resources is huge, much larger than the employment data suggests. Because employment data capture open unemployment. They don't capture significant components of underemployment. All this has to be kept in mind. You know, we get Hello. Hello.
Sir, நீங்கள் கண்டினியூ பண்ணுங்க சார். ஓகே சார்.
இது ஏதாவது பிக்சர் மாதிரி நல்லா இருக்குமே, பரவாயில்லையா?
ப்ராப்ளம் இல்லை சார்.
லைட்டிங் பரவாயில்லையா?
பரவாயில்ல சார், பரவாயில்ல சார், கண்டினியூ பண்ணுங்க சார்.
கண்டினியூ பண்ணலாமா?
ஓகே சார், ஓகே சார்.
Yeah, continue. Shall I continue?
Continue sir, you can continue sir.
எப்பா?
Continue பண்ணுங்க சார் நீங்க.
சார் எனக்கு லைட்டிங் போரா இருக்குன்னு பார்க்கறேன். வேற ஒண்ணும் இல்ல, ஒரு நிமிஷம் பார்க்கறேன். See if we can improve lighting. Is there improvement in lighting? Is poor man lighting? Poor man lighting, eh? Hello.
Okay sir, problem இல்லை சார், நீங்க continue பண்ணுங்க சார்.
Okay, so we'll continue because unfortunately my net connection is gone. Yeah. I hope கேக்குதா? Audible இருக்கா?
நீங்க பேசுறது கேக்குது சார்.
Okay, so we continue then. So, I was talking about GST and its implications and how that was not particularly helpful. And then I was talking about the period as a whole, leading up to three important aspects of the Indian economy situation today, which is manifested in some of the economic data as well. And this, I've not said much about growth rates because, 2014 to 19, one difficulty we have is that the credibility of the government numbers and growth rates has become very, very poor. And the method of calculation, as I mentioned to you earlier, had some difficulties, had some implications. So broadly, we can say that the growth rates were on the average lower in this period than had been the case earlier, or not significantly different in any event. But what we can say is that the three key problems came to the fore. One had been a continuing problem, namely the Agrarian Crisis, of which I mentioned the key feature as being the inability of a significant proportion of cultivator households to receive net positive income from crop cultivation. And of course, continuing increase in rural inequality and so on. The second problem that needs to be highlighted is the one concerning employment, where in fact you find that if you could take some quick numbers, I'll just show you the numbers. I'll read the numbers to you, not show it to you. Which is that, unemployment rates. First of all, in India, we must know something about how unemployment rates are calculated. You see, we have, on the one hand, we have something called the usual status unemployment rate, which is, taking a whole year as a reference period. And if you're employed during some part of the year, then you are reckoned as not being unemployed. If you're in the labor, if you are seeking work and not finding it, you are unemployed and part of the labor force. But the usual status unemployment rate is a very low measure of unemployment. It hardly varies. Generally, even that surprisingly grew sharply. The other, is it? Okay, for example, if you looked at 2004, 5, 11, 12, and 17, 18, we have data from the periodic labor force survey for the year 2017, 18. And these data suggest that take four categories: rural male, rural female, urban female. In all categories, the unemployment rate declines between 2004, 5, and 11, 12, and especially for females, where it declines for rural females from 15.2% to 9.7%, for urban females from 15.6% to 10.3%. And for men also, it declines marginally from 4.4% to 3.6% for males in rural areas, and 5.1 to 4% for urban males. But by contrast, we take 11, 12 to 17, 18, the Unemployment rates rise sharply for rural males from 3.6% in 11-12 to 10.5% in 17-18. For females from 9.7% to 17.3%. For urban males, it rises from 4% in 11-12 to 9.2% in 17-18. And for urban females, it rises from 10.3% to 19.8%. So sharp rise in unemployment rates is a feature of the period. The second important aspect of this worsening unemployment situation is that unemployment rates among youth is very high. Unemployment rates for those with formal technical training and so on rises very sharply from 5.7% in 11-12 to 13.8%, and for the males, and for females from 6.4 to 10.4%. The basic point is not looking at all the numbers here, which I'm going to send you the article so you can read at leisure, from which I'm drawing this data, something I've written. What you can say also is that the inability to get jobs led also to a dropout from the labor force. So you have a decline in what is called the labor force participation rate, where for 2004-5 to 17-18, if you make comparison, the rural female workforce participation is the sharpest decline from 41.5% in 2004-5, which is 17.5% in 2017-18. So very sharp decline in labor force participation, reflecting a very bleak employment situation. So I think it's important to understand that the second major element of crisis in the economy was the very bleak employment situation. It showed that growth had not really generated much employment. The third important reason, aspect of the crisis, has not been that widely discussed, but data is available from the National Sample Survey's monthly consumer expenditure data for 2011-12 and 2017-18. What do these data show? You remember, these are years, 11, 12, 17, 18, during which, especially between 14, 15 and 17, 18, government of India has been claiming high growth rates, right? Especially 8% after demonetization and so on. Now, what is the story? What is the story on consumption? So, if on the average, the Indian economy was growing as measured by GDP growth rate between 2011-12 and 17-18, let's say at about 6.5% or 7%, whatever claims are being made, then it's very surprising because the NSS data on household per capita monthly consumer expenditure shows an average decline per capita average consumption declines by 8.8% in rural India. In fact, this decline is practically across all deciles, maybe except the top few households possibly. But this is a very drastic decline. And you would expect per capita monthly household consumer expenditure to increase when growth is occurring, right? So on the one hand, you're claiming growth rate of 6-7%, but on the other hand, you find that the average monthly per capita consumer expenditure has declined absolutely by 8.8% in the same period, 11-12 to 17-18. Shows a disastrous decline in the purchasing power of most sections of the rural population. This is very much prior to the pandemic and all. What about urban areas? In urban areas, the same survey suggests that average per capita monthly consumer expenditure of urban households rose by 2.2% between 2011-12 and 17-18. This is a very marginal rise. And this rise may very well conceal a sharp decline in the lower deciles, compensated by an increase in the upper deciles. So the bottom 30-40% of the population, even in urban areas, bottom 30 to 40% of the households, very likely experienced a decline in monthly per capita consumer expenditure. In other words, the NSS data on consumer expenditure brings out sharply the point of a sharp decline in the purchasing power of a substantial section of the Indian population, both in rural India and in urban India. And you can see that this is actually telling you that there is a serious demand crisis in the economy. That should have been the obvious reading. But by this time we had gone to a scenario where the regime was unwilling to release data. So they have not even released data on consumer expenditure, claiming there's some discrepancies in this, that, and the other. They tried very hard not to get the unemployment data released, but ultimately it came out in public domain. And after the elections, officially the unemployment data was released. But data on agrarian economy, data on employment, and data on consumer expenditure, all of them suggest a very sharp decline in the economic status and the purchasing power of the mass of the Indian population. Therefore, it is no surprise that the Indian economy began to tank in 2018-19, and the slowdown in economic growth rates, GDP growth rates, became particularly sharp right from the latter part of 2018-19. And in 2019-20 and the period of the pandemic, all of 2020, we will see how much sharper the decline has been. But even from the last quarter of 18-19, the decline has started, even as measured by official GDP growth rates. But in terms of popular living standards, the decline actually predates 18-19, because you see this, what the data I'm talking about is 17-18. Consumer expenditure. You might, of course, argue that the 2017-18 data reflect the disastrous impact of both the 2016 demonetization fiasco and the ham-handed and poorly designed, as well as poorly implemented GST of 2017 June. Came into implementation the 1st of July 2017, and it has had a big impact on the 17-18 figures possibly. In any event, what is clear is that between 2014 and 2019, the living conditions of the ordinary people have not improved at all, despite a lot of rhetoric to the contrary and announcements of large numbers of schemes, whether you talk about Jan Dhan or you talk about, kind of make in India, you talk about things for startups and all that. But the macro impact of all these policies seem to have been very, very minimal, and the living standards of people have actually declined in this period, one can confidently say. But one can also say with equal confidence that inequalities have risen very sharply in this period. Now, one part of it has to do with the government's fiscal policies, which involved increasing indirect taxes and offering large concessions in direct taxes to the well-to-do. This was the period from 2014 to 18 that we also abolished the wealth tax, that we reduced the tax on corporate entities significantly. Mr. Jaitley did in his budget, and subsequently when Mrs. Nirmala Sitharaman became finance minister, she has continued to do this in 2019 budget and 2020 budget. So corporate tax rates have come down very sharply. Even as GST has meant more indirect taxes on the ordinary people. But more important, as international prices of petroleum declined very sharply from as much as $175 a barrel to $30 a barrel, there was no relief for the Indian population. Government of India simply kept on raising excise duties on petrol and diesel, on petroleum, so that it could absorb and essentially use all that as revenue for the government. So on an average, I think the numbers are there in the economic survey. Also, you might want to look at a very interesting annual publication, Indian Public Finance Statistics, brought out by the Ministry of Finance. It's an annual publication you can get on net, PDF copy is available, which shows you that every year, the Government of India's policy of not lowering petroleum and diesel prices inside the country, but simply using excise duties to absorb the windfall that came in the form of lower crude petroleum prices in the international markets, has meant every year 1 lakh crores plus additionally each year was going to the Government of India. And remember that when you move from GDP at factor cost to GDP at market prices, nothing else happens if the excise duty is increased, it will show an apparent growth as well, even with nothing else that happens. Or partly derived from this kind of a reckoning of GDP growth, which is based on GDP at market prices. So massive doses of indirect taxation hurting the ordinary people is one feature of the regime. Large concession to the private corporate sector especially, and of course foreign capital in taxation was the other feature of the regime. And in a sense, this is continued into 2019-20 in the pandemic period. So by the time we reached the pandemic, 2020, we're already at a point where between July 2019 and February 2020, including the budget of 2020, the government of India has gifted about 3 lakh crore rupees to the corporate sector, to the well-to-do, by way of removal of the surcharge on capital gains tax in stock market transactions, which help foreign finance capital in particular, by export subsidies of a large amount of 50,000 crores, by subsidies and concessions allowance for housing and real estate sectors, and of course by the whopping decrease in the corporate tax rate to a flat 22%, which according to the Finance Minister would cost Government of India a loss of about 1.45 lakh crores of tax revenue in a year. This was then followed by a budgetary exercise in 2020 February, which involved a reduction in direct taxes of 66,000 crores. So you add it all up, it comes to almost about 3 lakh crores, 2.9 lakh crores. And in order to meet the larger deficit implied by such a huge tax concession, Government of India proposed to sell about 2.1 lakh crore rupees worth of public sector assets. So this is you must see the connection that giving larger and larger concessions to corporate sector by way of lowering taxation rates in a country with huge inequality, you have no wealth tax, no estate duty, and you continue to give direct tax concessions, those who have the ability to pay. And then you're trying to recoup that by selling off public sector assets. In other words, the misguided focus on the fiscal deficit essentially becomes an implicit strategy of privatization. You're saying that government should not borrow, they should not tax the rich, and therefore they should ideally raise resources only by disinvesting public sector assets. So this fiscal deficit obsession, because of the fear of finance capital exiting, amounts to a strategy of privatization of very large kind. And you have this year you have Bharat Petroleum, LIC, many other big companies, top class performers being put on the market for sale. So this is a disastrous policy because it foregoes government earnings, and there is no economic logic to this kind of disinvestment that is happening. Government has not advanced any logic, except to say we need revenue. So raising revenue through disinvestment is not a very sensible option. There is no logic. If somebody is buying these shares, they obviously expect to make profits. So, and they are not quite fools, right? So either you are incurring losses because of specific requirements that public sector enterprises have to serve,
Sir, time over, sir.
And you have to subsidize them from the budget, or you have no logic for privatization. Anyway, I'll stop there. It looks like we have exceeded our time. Disruption in between. We'll try and catch this up in the final lecture tomorrow, which will cover the period from 2019 latter part to the current period. Thank you. Okay.
Thank you, sir.
Muchalama. Okay.
Okay, sir. Time over, sir.
Okay. Actually, yeah. Okay. Now, is it Pradama?
Okay, sir. Exit item, sir.
Okay.